Okay, welcome everybody this afternoon. Bienvenidos para esta tarde. We're going to have another series of conversation this afternoon. It's a perspective talk, particularly focused on experimental considerations. So we're going to have three speakers sharing some of their work and thoughts about how we could practice experimental theological aesthetics, followed by two responses, and then we're going to open for discussions. The first presenter is our ANJAN CHATTERJEE, professor in neurology, psychology, and architecture at the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you. So for people who don't live and breathe experimental work, there are really three things I want you to take away from anything I have to say, which is, number one, experiments are incremental. Number two, conclusions are provisional. And number three, there is no such thing as the perfect experiment. You're always making trade-offs, right? So whatever you think of anything else, just hold on to that. So when you're reading science, just remember that. So I thought what I'd do is present two kinds of work that we haven't figured out. We're just at the very beginning. And you may remember this general slide that I presented Thursday night, which was kind of charting the whole domain that I was going to talk about. But for this, I want to talk a little bit about, the very beginning steps of trying to develop a framework in which to look at a set of questions, and then this issue of diversity and individual differences. And we heard about WEIRD before, but you didn't explain the acronym, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, which is, in my world, the worry is that so much of our work has been done on weird populations. And weird populations does not mean that you guys, and I include myself in this, are peculiar, although that may be true. The acronym stands for Western, Educated, Industrial, Rich, Democratic. And so much of what we know of, or think we know of psychology, comes from this very narrow population, which is barely representative of the world's population. And if you're trying to make claims, broader claims, your sampling is really problematic, right? So that's how, when people talk about weird, we think about that. So again, this is the very beginnings. In the same way that Thursday night I talked about trying to create a database of artworks, we are at the beginning of trying to create a database of architectural images, interior images. So we have 480 images of different styles from around the world, just to have this as a repository that people can then use in order to ask questions that they might be of interest to them. And the question is the question, but you have to have something upon which you might ask questions. Just to give you a feel for some of these images, I talked about how in our research, we think that there are three important components to the human experience of the built environment, which are coherence, fascination, and hominess. And so in this database, just to give you an intuition, the image on the left was the highest rated image on hominess. The one at the top right was the highest rated image on coherence. And the one at the bottom was the highest rated image on fascination. And just to give you a feel, an empirically derived feel for what these images show. And this again is the taxonomy that I talked about before. How do you have a vocabulary to try to identify the potential impacts that art or architecture can have? And I won't go through again the way we derive that, but we can then use this taxonomy on these images as well as coherence, fascination, and hominess. So this is one way, a kind of way one can look at this, which is we look at these images of sacred spaces, and we look at images of prisons. And so you could argue that in some way, if you think sacred spaces are an environment to open people up, right? This is a widening of people's experience, that prisons in some ways are the opposite. It's a confining experience. And so you're going to think that whatever I come up with is going to be trivial. And the answer is it is trivial. But in some ways, there's a validity check that if we can't find a difference on these kinds of environments for some of our constructs, then we've got a problem. And then you have to go back and rethink of how you're even doing this. So just to show you what we find in terms of, as part of our norming study, we go back to this, and that we find that for, quite robust and consistent differences between how people react to religious spaces and prisons. And so, as you might imagine, people have more feelings of anger when they're looking at prison spaces. People feel more beauty, more calm, and these ideas of inspired, they like places that are depicting sacred spaces. And it's a broad swath of people doing these norms. So these aren't people who belong to any particular religious tradition. Now that's the kind of information we collect. So that's the sort of thing you can then go back and try to disentangle. What is it about people's backgrounds? And typically the variables that we're always interested in are openness to experience. This is a core construct of personality construct that generally people who are open to experiences tend to be open to aesthetic experiences as well. The second that we always look at is how much experience have people had with art, that the more experiences they've had by dint of their culture, their education, the context in which they grow up, people tend to be more open to these kinds of engagements. And the third is curiosity. It turns out that curiosity also varies as a personality factor, and people who tend to be more curious are also more open to, whether I want to call it challenged or, as Gordon suggests, demanding, those kinds of images or experiences that at first blush might appear challenging or ambiguous. People who are curious are more willing to engage and stay with it to perhaps get something out of those. And then, as I mentioned before, those dimensions can be looked at in more coarse grains. And as you would expect, that there's more negative affect when people are looking at images of prisons, more positive affect for religious spaces, and the sense of the possibility of transformation and the sense of immersion, right? So all of this is simply, as I said, is a kind of validation of what one would hope we would see. Because if we didn't see something like this, we'd say there's a problem with our stimuli, or there's a problem with how we're doing this. And then if we ask these questions about coherence, fascination, and hominess, what we see is that religious spaces are found to be more fascinating than prisons, and that people find themselves more at home. So that's a kind of question one could ask. Is it the case that people who have tend to be more religious, do they actually find these spaces more homey than other people, right? That's a kind of, you can go into the data to try to ask that kind of question. Interestingly, coherence not as different as the others, right? That prisons have a kind of logic, a spatial logic of their own as well. And so, the kinds of questions often come up is that, is there something about the low-level visual features of this? And those are things we also do, where you can look at measures of self-similarity and various other kinds of measures of image statistics that we also apply to this, just to see if there's something that we might think is maybe not as interesting, but might be accounting for some of the differences. But it also might be the case that what we think is a bug ends up being a feature. And you don't know that before you go ahead, that there might be, so in certain kinds of design, for example, fractality, a fractal dimension seems to be important, right? So that ends up often in these kinds of studies being a feature and not a bug. It's a low-level feature, but seems to have some effects. There are arguments made about how fractal patterns are recapitulating an abstract pattern that is found in nature. Okay? Again, this is the way you might start carving this out. There's a neuroscience question around this that we're interested in asking that's not going to be of interest to most people here, which is that there is this network in the brain called the default mode network, which if you haven't heard about it, you will, and you'll see it in a lot of things. That seems to be especially active when people are deeply moved by artwork. And also it is associated with a certain kind of mind wandering. It's associated with a certain rumination and a thoughtfulness. And in the literature, it is often associated with, is thought of as a good thing. And one of our hypotheses is that it is value neutral, and you can ruminate for bad reasons as well, is the kind of logic. And so the prediction when we get around to doing this is using these kinds of images to suggest that the neural response in the default mode network across these two domains of images is not going to be different, but what's going to be different is how they are connected to other parts of the brain where valuation happens. So again, the goal here is to try to address a neuroscience question that you guys, most of you don't care about, but it is to say that here, something that has been in the literature talked about as an unequivocal good, I would like to at least test that idea to say the value is not happening in the kind of this sort of mind wandering, because the nature of the mind wandering itself can be good or bad. And where we index that is how is this network connected either to reward systems or to areas of the brain that we think are associated with anxiety and threat. So you could imagine the amygdala, for example, right? So that's aside. So that was just one thing that now we have this repository. We're going to write it up. And there, the idea is that this ends up being a resource for anybody. These end up being made public, who can go into this database and say, I'm particularly interested in this kind of building versus this kind of building. Here are some norms. And then you use that to then design an experiment that is a question that you are interested in. So the second one, and this is also this is brand new data. We just started analyzing it a week ago, so we're still trying to absorb it. But I think some of it touches on a couple of topics that have come up in the last couple of days. So as I mentioned before, we use as a general framework the aesthetic triad, and the idea that experiences can be thought of as having this kind of sensory motor component. And then it can be thought of as having an emotional component. When we talk about beauty, there's always an element of pleasure, not confined to pleasure, but that seems to be a component. And then the kind of knowledge, meaning, set of associations we have. And so that has been a framework that we've been using for a while. And the idea is that this is iterative, right? That things feed into each other. That when you have an intense emotional reaction to something, we think that also boosts the sensory attention, the kind of sensorial experience of it as well. So we used from the art database that I talked about Thursday night, we picked images that were broadly regarded as of lower interest, and we can debate about the specific images, but this is, we are not choosing these. This is what, from the data we're getting, and images that were thought to be of higher interest. And the strategy here is to take images where we think there's going to be variability in responses, right? So this is a case where variance is actually our friend in terms of modeling the data, right? You might have another strategy where you don't want variability, right? So we're talking about, the kind of experiments that that Julio and Matt have done, where you want a very specific population and you're trying to limit variance in that case and not have a lot of data. But in this case, variance is useful for us. And what we're trying to look at is it the case that these three broad domains of the aesthetic triad is cashed out differently in the brain? So the experiment is that people come in, we have a kind of instructional video that everybody is shown of what we mean by these three domains, the sensory motor, the emotional, and the associations, the semantic associations. And what we have is ask people to reflect on what the imagery is evoking in them, what kind of associations they have, and is it in any way relevant to their life, right? And then we have, for the sensory motor, we have people focusing on the formal properties of what they're looking at, the shape, the color, the composition, the lines. And for the emotions, we have them query themselves. What are they feeling as they're looking at this? And none of this is prescriptive, that people have their experiences as they are. And so they're in the scanner now, and they're looking at this. And in a block design, in some blocks, we have them just focus on the sensory qualities. In different blocks, we have them just focus on their emotional experience. And in some blocks, we have them just focus on the set of associations they might have. Now, they're looking at the same images, so this is already quite constrained in the sense that that they are looking at the same images repeatedly. And so here's an experimental strategy, which is any differences we see based on our conditions can't be explained by low-level features of the art images, because they're seeing the same images. And so this takes you to a question of, it's not about the specifics of the image, but the mental state in which we hope we are getting people to be in when they're looking at these images, right? So what we find, and so the strategy here, so this is, we take an area of visual cortex as the sensory part. And again, a big generalization is to say, the brain is always working, right? The brain is always active. When you hear people say 10% of the brain is working, that are nonsense, right? So the question we're always asking is, relative to one condition, what is this area doing in contrast with another? So we have a seed in the visual cortex, and we're saying, how does that activity from that correlate with other parts of the brain when people are doing the sensory component as compared to the thinking, as compared to the feeling? And so I'll point out that in the sensing versus feeling, we see no difference. And I think that's useful to know. When we use, so we use a seed in the right insula, which is an important part of kind of how our emotions are cashed out. It's connected to our autonomic nervous system, that we ask feeling versus sensing, again, not very much. And we get a little bit about feeling versus thinking, but I'm gonna hold off on that because this in some ways is the most interesting. And we're still trying to understand what all this means, but when you use parts of the medial prefrontal cortex as our seed for thinking, and look at how activity is correlated from that location in the other conditions, we get that when people are thinking, that there's more activity compared to sensing in a bunch of language areas that, that is consistent with the kind of cognitive thinking that people might be engaged in. And also, quite interestingly, that parts of visual cortex is actually suppressed. And that there is a way in which we might infer from that is that when people are cognizing, when they are thinking about this, that the visual input is actually decreased, that there's a kind of a kind of suppression of visual information, visual activity at the time. And so that's all I'm going to say right now. And the reason I said that this touches on some of the things that have come up is that, and in other experiments we've done, it looks like it is very hard for people to separate out sensing and feeling, that our perceptions seem to be laden with value. And it's really hard to separate those out. That's what the neural data show. That's what in other experiments we've observed. Whereas when you get to this other level of actually cognizing, of thinking, you get a separation from those two systems. So thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, ANJAN.
Yep.
So next, we're going to have Ian Church. He's an associate professor at Hillsdale College.
Yeah, so everything that ANJAN just said about provisional and no perfect experiment design, you should probably go ahead and double that whenever a philosopher is doing the experiment. So just keep that in mind here. Perfect. Cool, awesome. So what I'm wanting to do here today is very briefly showcase some research that my team and I have been doing for the past 5 or so years on the problem of evil. And the reason I want to share this with you is that what we're seeing, again, provisionally, right, but we're seeing it repeatedly now, is that context seems to play an important role in diminishing our sense of pointlessness, right? It seems to play a role in diminishing whether or not we take a target instance of suffering to be pointless. And the reason I want to give that to you, I want to present that to you, is that I want to put forward a thought that perhaps, if it's right, and I suspect many of you will agree with me, this sounds appropriate, sounds correct. If it's right to say that architecture, aesthetic experiences can be rich with context and narrative, then we might suspect that architecture and aesthetic experiences will be really genuinely important in diminishing people's sense of pointlessness when they suffer, when they're struggling with pain in their world. Okay. So I'll talk about our initial study on the problem of evil that we did, some follow-up research, and then I'll just try to briefly reflect on some applications. So let's start with this mess, right? So this comes from, actually, it's a really good argument, but it's a lot of things, lots of to read. This is William Rowe's 1979 formulation of the problem of evil, the most cited formulation of the problem of evil in the contemporary literature. So premise 1 reads, there exist instances of intense suffering, which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Premise 2, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Therefore, there does not exist an omnipotent, omniscient, wholly good being. Okay, so I've been using this term pointless, and this comes from Rowe himself. And Rowe essentially using pointless as a shorthand for some sort of intense suffering that's not bringing about some greater good or permitting some or preventing some sort of evil equally bad or worse. And so we might simplify the argument a bit like this, if it's easier to get your head around it. Your premise 1 is essentially saying there exists pointless suffering in the world. Pointlessness understood in this kind of way. Premise 2 is saying if there's a God, then there won't be genuinely pointless suffering in the world, and therefore there is no God. Okay. Now Rowe wants to say that premise 2 or 5 here, that if there's a God, then there won't be pointless suffering, is relatively uncontroversial. I think most people are going to agree on that. And let's give that to them. And so we might want to know, why should we think that premise 1 is true? Why should we think there is pointless suffering in the world? Well, here's Rowe's answer. Right? He gives these sort of thought experiments. Like we've sort of noticed that philosophers like to trade in thought experiments. Here's a famous one. All right, suppose in some distant forest, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire, and the fire, a fawn, is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. Okay? And so part of what Rowe wants to say here is that, well, look, insofar as that seems like a pointless bit of suffering to us, that's some evidence for thinking that it is pointless. It may not be. There may be some point for it all, but insofar as it seems pointless to us, that's some evidence for thinking that it is pointless. Okay? And insofar as we have some evidence that it is pointless, then that's some evidence against theism. It's not going to be a proof per se, but it's giving you some evidence against theism. That's sort of how the idea is meant to go here. Now, there's all sorts of questions, empirical questions we might ask about this. You know, does Rowe's assessment vary across demographics? We wanted to know that. I was really interested in whether or not it mattered that we're talking about a fawn, right? It seems like a Bambi, right? This is a maximally cute critter. Whereas if we thought about a vulture or a boar, would that change our intuitions? I really thought it would. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Okay? I was surprised. Okay? But the bigger question I want to talk about here is, does context matter? And I think a lot of people, when they see this 2-sentence vignette, they might respond by saying, well, look, of course it's going to seem pointless. It's only 2 sentences long. Like it's ripped from any sort of context or narrative. So of course it's going to seem pointless. Well, we can explore that. Right? Maybe if we provide some context around the suffering, about forest fires, when and why they occur, or whatever, maybe that will diminish the sense of pointlessness. So we had all sorts of hypotheses about gender education. Don't need to worry about that, right? Ethnicity, religion, cuteness. I really thought cuteness would matter. I'm really genuinely upset about this. But context, right? We thought the presence of context would significantly reduce the perception of pointlessness. Okay. So just, I'll just go over this really quickly. We had 1,506 participants. We essentially put them in a high context group, low context group, and then we put them into all these different categories about, this is saying fawn, no picture, fawn, picture. I don't have time for this. But we had to include pictures and all this kind of stuff, trying to elicit that cuteness response. But anyway, right? This is what sort of how we wanted to do it. I'll just move very quickly through this stuff. So despite ANJAN's concerns about being cautious about any given study, my approach here is going to be like, trust me, bro, at this stage. Okay. Okay, so here's what we saw in our initial study, very, very quickly. Okay, so we have all these different variables, like this is the low context, no picture, high context, no picture, all these different animal types we're trying out, all this stuff, right? Fine, ignore all that. What I want you to see is that anything at 8 is sort of a middling score. Anything above would be agreeing with Rowe's intuitions. Anything with below 8 would be disagreeing with Rowe's intuitions. And so what we see then is that as soon as you provide context, high context, we see this drop. It drops every single time, right? Again and again and again. You provide high context, and that significantly diminishes the sense of pointlessness. Okay, whoops. So what in the heck's going on here? What in the heck is happening? We thought that was really fascinating. Well, one hypothesis here was that, well, maybe what's happening is that our context is containing a sneaky theodicy, right? Some sort of explanation for why the suffering is occurring, right? Maybe that's what's doing it. We're providing a sneaky theodicy, and that's what's causing this effect. Right? We got some of this. We published some of our initial results, and our referees very helpfully pointed out all the ways we might explain away our effect in some ways, helpfully. So maybe it's a sneaky theodicy. Maybe the context is just there to distract people. So imagine you are a defense attorney, and some particularly damning evidence has just been leveled against your client. What you might then do is try to just flood the jury with information about your client so they lose track of the damning evidence. Maybe that's what's happening here. People are just losing track of the suffering amidst everything else we told them. Maybe the context was too optimistic, too Lion King-y circle of life kind of thing, right? Maybe, right? maybe the optimistic valence, the lexical effects of the language we were using was impacting people's judgments on this stuff. Or maybe the context was making salience how little they know, right? Making people aware of all the stuff they don't know about forest fires. And as they become aware of all the stuff they don't know about forest fires, they might say, well, look, maybe there's a point. Like, what can I know? Okay, so we turn all these into hypotheses, right? So maybe if you thought theodicy was doing the work, then let's give a full-throated theodicy, huh? Let's really make it, let's lay it on and see if that gets the same result. If we think junk is doing the work, well, let's give them a junky context. If you think it's just a distraction, let's just give them a distraction and see if we see a similar result. If you think the original context was too optimistic, let's give them a really negative one. And let me tell you, I really tried to turn up the negativity here. Okay, so I told a story about a forest fire and an international corporation seized on the opportunity of this burnt out forest to pave it all and to then build a mall that would sit empty, that would go out of business and sit empty for decades to come. Like nothing redemptive about this story at all. Okay? I really tried to turn it up to 11 there. Okay, and what if we another context condition? What if we had people explicitly reflect on how little they know about a given bit of suffering? Okay. So again, we had 818 people we surveyed this time, put them into these different context groups. We had the no context condition, which is just a 2-sentence vignette. Our original context condition, we're going to try to replicate our findings. Theodicy condition, junk condition, negative condition, skepticism, skeptical theism condition. Right. Get on with it. So here's what we end up seeing. Here, so 0 sort of neither here nor there, neither agreeing or disagreeing with row. Once again, no context, by far the most agreement with Row's intuitions. Right? If you just the two-sentence two-sentence version elicits the strongest response in Row's favor. Jump context, which was essentially what I did there, is I tried to come up with some sort of context that's going to be narratively thin, right? So like fires produce light. Light travels at a certain speed per second, just random facts about light, not really any story, stitching it together. That did something, right? It significantly diminished the perception of pointlessness. But I want you to see here, our regular context condition was by far the strongest in making people move away from the intuitions with Row. I'm really surprised by that. Again, we are seeing a significant drop. It's not different from 0. It's not statistically different from 0 here. But again, I would have thought, if anything, cranking up the negativity as I did, that would have amplified the perception of pointlessness. But it still diminished it. Right? But not as much as regular context. Theodicy, again, this is a full-throated theodicy. We really tried to put it on thick. And it did have an impact, right? Significant impact, but not as strong as regular context. Skeptical theism, again, significant impact, but not as strong as regular context. I don't think the lessons that we can learn here are very clean. I'm going to, my next couple of slides here, let me just do this. I'm being a bit silly here. I'm playing around a bit, right? But because I don't think we can completely rule out any of these explanations, any of these hypotheses entirely. Side note: this is why I made the X translucent, because I was like, I don't really mean it. But you know, look, like we definitely didn't see that theodicies are producing an even stronger effect than pointlessness. Theodicies played an effect; they did something, right? But that doesn't seem to fully explain the result we were seeing. Okay. Likewise, junk. It did something, right? It moved it off of the no context. Some junky context was better than no context. But nevertheless, it doesn't seem to be equally diminishing reports of pointlessness. Right? It doesn't seem to fully explain what's going on here. And again, context with an aggressively negative valence will not diminish reports of pointlessness. We didn't see that. Right? It didn't do as much as our regular context condition, but even the negative context really significantly drop down the perception of pointlessness. Unless, again, asking participants to reflect on how little they know, you know, it kind of produced a similar result. It certainly wasn't as strong as our other one. So this was our attempt to try to sincerely try to explain why context is playing the role that it's having. Like, why is it that we're seeing this pattern that whenever you provide some sort of context, you're going to see this diminishment of sense of pointlessness, as we're using Rowe's terminology here. And none of it really seems to entirely pan out. None of these explanations seem to really capture what's going on here. And there's lots to say about this. And again, sort of the question that might be on your mind now is, how does this relate to the issues with aesthetics? And what I want to suggest here is that perhaps it is the case that if we agree that our aesthetic experiences, architecture can communicate context, often sort of narratival rich context, then that might play an important role in diminishing people's sense of pointlessness when they struggle with suffering. And I take it this is really quite important because it's often in places of worship that people are pouring out their souls, are wrestling with the divine, or wondering to know what is the meaning of all this. Okay? And so we might think, okay, if our places of worship are narratively thin, we're certainly not going to be doing anyone any favors. That's the concern here. If this is right, provisional, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Take that all along with this. Now, there's a lot of stuff. Okay, I'll finish up. There's all sorts of ways we can tie this into broader literature within philosophy and psychology, right? So Eleanor Stump has done some amazing work on the importance of narratives in dealing with suffering. If you haven't read her book, Wandering in Darkness, you definitely should. It's amazing. See some work, newer work in experimental philosophy by Maria Steckman, The Whole Story, Identity, and Narrative. In this paper, she argues that many of these philosophical vignettes that we trade in philosophy are going to be ill-equipped to capture genuinely our philosophical intuitions. Oftentimes, the kinds of philosophical intuitions that really matter to us are going to be elicited more by extended stories, right? So she's trying to sort of talk about a methodological question that comes up when it comes to contemporary philosophy. All sorts of work in psychology about those kind of stories we tell, the way we try to redeem our stories, redeem our experiences, right? All this stuff is going on. Okay? And again, as we've all pointed out, there's this concern that the modern American church is often pursuing architecture and design that is arguably contextually thin. Right? It's not really communicating much. Right? Whereas the kind of aesthetic experiences you might get with a wide variety of approaches to architecture, there's a story that you can live in, right? A story you can sort of inhabit, a context in which to place and experience your suffering that you will inevitably experience. And I'm struck by how many sort of old cathedrals had all these sort of stories woven into the architecture. And I'm not someone who knows much of anything about architecture, as I'm sure you can tell, but many of them are in the shape of crosses, right? And you would, you'd go to the center of the cross for the Eucharist. There'd be this sort of story, this procession, this kind of this narrative you would be inhabiting for that experience, for the liturgy. This would all matter for your experience there. And so if this is right, if all this research that we're seeing is correct, I want to suggest to you for our discussion and conversation this possibility that the kinds of narratives and contexts that we can find in our architecture, in our art, in our aesthetic experiences will have a real concrete impact on how people experience suffering. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you. So the last presenter today for the experimental discussion is Robin Jensen. Robin is an emeritus professor of art history, and theology, Notre Dame University.
I'm just going to jump in and sort of go over a few points. And this is my reflection on what we did and how well we did it. And I've told a few of you already, I'm sort of glad my two colleagues aren't here because I'm going to be sort of critical of what happened here. But they've already heard from me, so this would not surprise them, but they might not appreciate it so much. So I'm going to remind you of the kind of, what were our questions, how we established protocols to try to answer those questions in experimental modes, what I think we got as some results, and then I want to talk about my sense of the challenges and even my disappointments. That's going to be sort of straightforward and honest. So first of all, just to kind of recap, our questions were sort of the when, where, what, who, and how of these viewers' engagement with spiritual art. So the first question was, and really I started with the question of where. If we ask viewers to engage visual art in a chapel space or a church space, is that going to be qualitatively different than if they see it in a museum space or a secular space like an office or a gallery or a hallway? So that was my first starting point. That's where I actually started the grant application process, was to answer that question. I had reflected on an experiment in the Worcester Museum in which they tried an experiment of pushing a kneeling bench up in front of a crucifix and invited people to pray and asked them for how they felt about their experience praying in a public museum. And it was not a happy result. And I could probably dig up all of the responses to that. And I've often thought about that. When we have a very sacred piece of art in a secular context, how do viewers engage it? And I know I mentioned sort of the question of, would you allow a Greek Orthodox person to come and kiss an icon in a museum? You know, maybe you would probably get arrested, or at least. So there's a question of how these images change in ways of our perception and our reception of them. The next question was, does it matter what time of the year you viewed these pieces? So did it matter kind of event structure? If you viewed these pieces in a sacred season like Lent or maybe Advent, would that change the way that viewers saw them over against what we Christians call ordinary time, or what people in liturgical traditions call ordinary time? Would it also matter if it was in finals week, or it was in a time when some other event was going on in the space in which you're looking at it? If you're in a church, are you going at a time when there's a service going on? Is there something else happening? A wedding, an organ practice, a choir practice? These kinds of things can deeply affect the experience of viewing. And so that was a question of time and event. Another question was, who's viewing this? And so we had a fairly homogeneous subject group. There were 150 Notre Dame students, most of them freshmen and sophomores, taking Psych 101. So large proportion of Catholics, smaller proportion of people of other religious traditions, most of them fairly pious, but and most of them fairly well educated in art appreciation, but not necessarily art history majors or anything of the sort. Then the question of how are people viewing this? So we tried thinking about the question of the quality of the viewing experience and the length of the viewing experience. As I think ANJAN mentioned, the average time spent in front of any artwork in a museum is about 27 seconds at max. So we talk about long looking, those kinds of experiments, trying to change the people's, the how of their viewing experience. Not so much about why. We didn't get to why. So all those journalistic questions. So these were our questions. There were a lot of them. They took place. We sort of tried to develop protocols to answer these questions over about 7 years. The first problem we ran into was we started this during COVID. And so we couldn't just actually walk around with people in museum settings or and so forth. So there was sort of this question of social distancing, as we had to think about ways to do this without actual contact. The second problem, and I should have realized this when I started, is that you don't really move artworks around very easily. Art gallery curators are not happy about taking things off their walls and moving them around for you. So much less very large monumental pieces of sculpture. because I had already decided that we would use these two very similar kinds of works, one of them in our campus basilica, and this is an example here, and one of them in an outdoor sculpture park, very different. So this is a question of what? I guess I didn't get to the what part, so let me go back a little bit. So what is the subject matter and what is the style, and how do these things affect the viewing experience? So I had chosen this set of 13 Stations of the Cross in our very traditional representational art, in our very elaborate, if anybody's, how many people know the Notre Dame Basilica? It's fairly elaborate. And it's actually the second most visited tourist site in the state of Indiana after the Indiana Speedway. But anyway, that's another story. So it's a very complex, elaborate space, very sacred to the students and so forth. In the sculpture park, it's a place almost none of our students had even visited. They didn't usually get out there. And these are 7 groups of standing monolithic groups of stones called the cycle of life, life of Christ. So also a cycle, a devotional cycle intended to prompt prayer in both cases, but very different in environment and very different in style. So that was what we were going to try to compare. But you can't really move either sets of these objects. So that was the second big problem we faced. So the ways we designed experiment protocols to begin with were to take photographs of the objects, the stations in the basilica and the stations, the cycle of life, monolithic standing stones in our sculpture park, and try to project them onto labs and screens in laboratories. First with white backgrounds, and then we played around with this changing of the environment. So we superimposed these photographs of these objects onto a football stadium, or as you've seen, a casino, a fast food restaurant, and so forth. But that actually, to be honest, didn't create a lot of results. And we realized that we had a very low level of immersive experience. So I'm really summarizing 7 years of work, so it's going to take me, but bear with me. So then we tried another experiment. We tried reserving a chapel space on campus and an office space on campus, and then took a group of both secular and sacred images, representational and abstract artworks, and we put them on tablets, on iPads. And we put students in the chapel or in the office, and we had them look at the works, and then we asked them questions. What we were interested in both cases was the viewing process. So in the lab, they were wearing eye tracking devices, but they weren't so much in these other spaces. But we also were going to test their memories of what they saw. How much did they remember immediately after they saw of the details of the work? You know, what were the figures wearing? What was Jesus doing? And many of them really already knew. In the case of the Stations of the Cross, Catholic students are pretty much familiar with the Stations of the Cross series. So that's Jesus falling for the second time, you know, that's, and so forth. And then the second question was what they remembered several days later. So both gist and detail. So what was going on in the image? What are the perceptual details? What was color was Jesus wearing? How many people were in the picture, and so forth. In both cases, in both of these experiments, we didn't see a lot of significant results, to be honest. There wasn't a vast difference. 2 things came forward. One was that because of the difficulty, and I'm thinking a lot of Taylor's presentation, the difficulty of understanding abstract works for these caused a higher level of cognition and a stronger memory for details later. They didn't like them. They didn't find them beautiful. We were really dealing with students mostly said, this is just a bunch of rocks. But they remembered them, and they had a stronger cognitive activity, both by measuring the eye tracking as they looked at the images on lab screens, and by our measurements of memory later. In the instances where they were taken to a chapel space or an office space with these images on iPads, what we noticed is something that my colleague Gabriel was mostly interested in were these spontaneous I can never say this, spontaneous autobiographical memories were more frequent in the office. There were more of them in the office space reported than in the chapel space, but they were stronger in the chapel space than in the office space. And Gabriel basically said, well, you know, that's because office spaces are really boring. So they had to do something else with their imagination. So again, we weren't seeing a lot. We're seeing replicated a little bit in terms of better memory for abstract works than representational works. Finally, in order to try to create some kind of real environment, because we still can't move these artworks around, we decided to try the virtual reality, and that's where we're gonna. So this is the eye tracking process. These are the stations. These are the stations superimposed on lap screens in incongruent backgrounds. And here we are in these, I think, pretty dreadful, actually, virtual reality spaces, a warehouse, a chapel type of space. This is the gallery type of space. This is the chapel type of space. And here's the warehouse type of space. And then we populated these with images that we chose and projected them. So students would wear virtual reality headgear and be ushered around in these spaces to encounter works of art. And then we're asked questions about them. You know, how did they view them? Did they like them? Were they emotionally engaging? Did they find them beautiful? And so forth. And then several days later, they were asked again what they saw. Frankly, not a lot of differences in our results. Pretty minimal differences, distinctions. So I wanted to, so that's sort of a kind of a summary of our results. And I can give you more details if you want about eye blink processes and all that kind of stuff. But I want to offer some sort of thoughts about interdisciplinary work and some critique. I know this is risky, but this is a paragraph that I wrote for an essay that we got published in a neuroscience journal. Cross-disciplinary ventures always offer both opportunities and challenges. These were evident in our team of psychologists, theologians, and art historians. Now, I was both the theologian and the art historian. I had to wear two hats, but anyway. For example, art historians approach this project differently because of their disciplinary training. They normally attend more closely to objects than to viewers. That's really interesting for me. I always think this is part of what I've learned. Rather than focus on an object's aesthetic qualities, its formal elements, or its influence or place within the history of art, this research project focused on the viewer's experience and paid virtually no attention to these other aspects of the art. Theologians, unused to using visual art as a basis for constructing theories or summarizing historical arguments about the nature or content of religious belief, had to accept that while artworks by themselves are not theological documents, they actually present and advance theologically informed concepts in visual form. Now, I always thought that was true, but I will say a lot of my colleagues didn't think so. So I'm speaking for the people who are not in the room. Scientists, for their part, find it challenging to structure and control experiments that might objectively measure how people are spiritually affected or how they find meaning in works of art. Our psychologists had never been asked to do this kind of work. So they were learning all kinds of new stuff about theology and even about art. Working together, the team needed to find ways to work collectively and collaboratively, respecting each other's distinct intellectual approaches while recognizing the variables that inevitably affect whether and how individuals find religious inspiration or meaning by gazing at sacred art. So while we really liked each other a lot, and we still do, we had very different approaches. So a few points, I'm getting the sign, a few points of criticism. Do attempts to replicate an in-person experience of a sacred art object, as in a church or a museum, with projected or AI-produced images on screens or in virtual reality spaces actually work? What is lost? Is this even art any longer? Secondly, can experiments in a laboratory setting be in any way commensurate to encounters in real life with art in the wild? Third, do the necessary limitations imposed on conducting of experiments to norm data or get scientifically replicable results run counter to the variability of individual encounters from person to person and day to day? Then how well do we account for individual dispositions, levels of knowledge about art, familiarity with subject matter, expectations, or fluctuating attitudes, moods, and desires? People are different and their perceptions do change. Next, do we sufficiently consider the docent effect, that's my term, before and after encounters with some basic instruction about the artwork? Is art appreciation in general permitted, overcoming discomfort with unfamiliar styles, and so forth? And finally, I'll end, what do we finally mean by spiritual cognition or spiritual flourishing? Or how would we reliably and scientifically, or even meaningfully, measure these qualities through short-term experiments? What is beauty? And how do we identify it in the concrete? We can talk about it in the abstract. We can talk about it as a wonderful concept. But I'm not sure, in the end, as a person who is an art historian and work with objects, when we can really judge one thing is beautiful and something else might not be. And I also worry, and I'll just end with this, when does that become idolatry? So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to have now two respondents. First, Brandon Rowe is architect and design manager at the LDS Church in Salt Lake City.
Well, great. All those presentations had very beautiful ties together. I think I'd like to focus one by one. With ANJAN's presentation, you know, some of the challenges that seem essential and sometimes with our sacred experience in these buildings, they resist reduction in some regards. I think as well, buildings are not simply stimuli, but they're environments. Perhaps even more precisely, they are events, as maybe I suggested earlier. But it appears that sometimes these sacred architecture environments unfold through a series of processions, threshold, light, acoustics, ritual choreography. So we ask ourselves when conducting these experiments, can we truly isolate a static visual frame? Does that misrepresent the phenomenon in and of itself? So I guess a question for ANJAN and all of us to consider is, how might we design experiments that preserve this unfolding performative nature of sacred environments? And for Ian, with this idea of humans as narrative animals, sacred architecture is definitely story-like. And you hit upon it in the last slide. And so I'm kind of approaching this from an architect's perspective. But this idea that it also possesses a narrative structure and that we might have a better chance for success if it has narrative or story-like qualities, especially if humans are hardwired for narrative and storytelling. So it seems that these sacred spaces are narrative environments. They spatialize cosmology, they're materializing the theology and choreographing movement within a larger story. So this kind of raises a question. What happens when sacred spaces are context thin, like you suggested, or lack the sacred narrative? Do these environments risk amplifying ambiguity, or are they creating contemplative openness? And can we experientially distinguish between a narrative embedded in the built environment and these narratives projected also by the perceiver themselves when they're coming to a building. For Robin, you touched on a lot of fascinating nuances of the experimental process. It appears that some of the variables, like you're mentioning of setting, season, style, and viewing, these are all affecting behavior, perception, memory, and meaning in different ways. And so I wonder if sacred spaces is, like you mentioned, rarely encountered as an isolated piece of artwork. It's more experienced maybe as an atmosphere that unfolds over time. And so we ask ourselves, I guess, this question of what is conditioning the receptivity to this? And you hinted on that with the different demographics and the times of the years and all of those things. So I wonder if we're also measuring this spiritual depth directly, or are we measuring the environmental affordances that make this spiritual depth more likely? So those are some thoughts.
Thank you. Next will be Milton Chimberg, Principal Emeritus of Chimberg and Levinus.
So I really enjoyed these talks. I want to note first, though, that we have 2 architects who are reviewing 3 researchers, although this architect is a student in research, and I do not claim that at all. So ANJAN, one of the things that I wanted to comment on, we've talked about before, is that you're a master of making the science and the research intelligible to others. So my question or my challenge to you is, how do we get architects, thick-skulled architects, to receive this information and adapt it into practice? So I'd like to ask you about that. And the other realm is intuition. Architects usually work on the basis of intuition and not research. So in a sense, we have developed immunity to facts. The question is, how do you get that to change? One thing that you mentioned in your abstract, I didn't understand at all, and I hope you can educate me, which was that behavior precedes biology. So if you can get to that a little bit, I would appreciate it. Ian, I'm very impressed with the virtues of narrative. In my own work, narrative is the key that unlocks projects. When I ask people to open up their thoughts and share them, with very little prompting, they lead me toward wisdom. And if I bring my preconceptions, I don't get that. So question for you is, you were providing narratives to them to support the research. My question is, did you ask them to come back with open-ended narratives in the process? And if so, what did you gain from that? And Robin, I want to compliment you on being candid that the results were not what you hoped and that you have more work to do. And I'm hoping that your data, which is robust, can be revisited and reinterpreted. Basically, I think that context does matter enormously. And in the representations that you use to establish context, I think it's very difficult for the students probably to place themselves in those contexts. So perhaps there's some way to revisit what I think is a very good setup to elicit responses.
Thank you, Milton. Maybe the 3 speakers could go there so they could see you on Zoom. You want to respond?
Can I go first? Yeah. So start with Brandon. What's the value of studying architecture with flat 2-dimensional images, right? On first principles, you might say this is completely ridiculous. And even if you were to put this in the context of an imaging study, which I didn't present today, it becomes even more ludicrous because for imaging studies, fMRI studies, you have to lie flat and not move at all, right? If you move an inch, all you get is noise. So the critique is well-founded that on first principles, you would say that kind of study has no bearing, very little resemblance with the act of actually moving through a space, which is what much of our architectural experiences are. So having said that, I would say that those are the kinds of trade-offs you make between control and ecologic validity. And it is a common practice, and I would say just in these sessions, looking at two-dimensional flat images that Craig presented, that Roberto presented, of buildings I've never been in. And yet I feel like there's something about those images that captured me. So I would say that the practice that architects often have in presenting work with two-dimensional images, flat images, is not empty of content. So having said that, what we also try to do is then take the same constructs and take that out into the wild to see if those same constructs still apply. And so far, in our hands, they seem to apply. And then one piece that has not come up here in this conversation is there an intermediate form that maintains some of the ecologic validity of the real world and some of the control you can get in a laboratory setting? And what we are doing is trying to think about this in immersive VR. And so not the kind of VR that Robin presented, but where we're actually hyper scanning physical spaces and using Apple Vision, where you feel like you are in that space. Now, there's still limits. You don't have the smell. There are certain sensory qualities that are different, but it ends up being closer to the sense that you are immersed in a three-dimensional space. And we have the control of having this be in the laboratory where we can manipulate things in a way that you can't if you're out in the wild.
All right, thank you very much for the comments, Brandon and Milton. I really do appreciate it. So when it comes to narratively thin environments, the thoughts that I had was that essentially if we are dealing with an aesthetic experience, an architectural place, a location, a place of worship that is thin in context, that we at least minimally won't be doing anybody any favors when it comes to trying to help them deal with suffering that they're experiencing. Now, I think we are narrative creatures, and I think narratives permeate our environment and our relationships with each other. And so I think we have access to narratives and context in lots of different ways. And so when it comes to, say, dealing with the hiddenness of God, which I really genuinely struggle with, right? The hiddenness of God amidst suffering, amidst grief, and so on and so forth, right? God that's presented to us as a beloved, a friend, a father, so on and so forth, right? One of the best answers for me that I've come to in wrestling with that has been sort of seeing the face of God in the Christian context, in the body of Christ, right? Being surrounded by his people, seeing the face of Christ in his people more and more. And so that's a way that we get context. That's the way that we get narrative. And so part of what I'm wanting to say is like, look, if all you have is architecture, right? Let's say you are, and I promise I'm not trying to be autobiographical here, but let's say you're traveling on a trip and you're experiencing a crisis of faith, and you stumble into a church, right? You're going to be able to, I mean, the hypothesis, it's an empirical question, right? Would be that if you're in a space that is more narratively rich and context rich, you'll be in a better place to try to step back, maybe remove yourself, decenter yourself from your suffering, than if you walked into, a warehouse church, right? And so that's the hypothesis I'm wanting to put forward there. And Milton, when it comes to trying to get narratives from our participants, I think that's a fantastic idea. We didn't do that in our initial studies, but we're already sketching out lots of opportunities for future research. And that, I started sketching out some new hypotheses here, because one possibility could be that when we sort of asked people, invited them to reflect on what they don't know about a situation, that could have given them an opportunity to reflect on sort of new narrative stories about that suffering. And so maybe even there, what's diminishing the sense of pointlessness isn't so much the skepticism per se, but it's the new narratives that they were providing themselves. And so that'd be something we definitely want to explore later going forward. Thank you both. Appreciate it.
I probably should say, I really wanted to emphasize the complexities and difficulties of working across disciplines. And I've been an interdisciplinary person myself most of my life, but it's been stayed within the humanities area. So history, art history, theology. And so to work with people who really work very differently was the big challenge for all of us, I think. Although I was 2-on-1, as one of you pointed out to me. I had 2 guys on 1. And so we had to really negotiate. And I'm thinking about the question of what projection can do. And it comes back to what ANJAN was just saying. One of the things that an art historian struggles with in I'm looking for Taylor to give me some backup here, is that you're showing projected images. And in those projected images, you can't, unless you try really hard, get across the experience of seeing the piece of work in a reality. The colors are going to be wrong. The size won't be clear. It will just not be the same. So we want to bring our students into museums and have them encounter real works of art, but that's not the way we usually teach most of the time. It's the same with architecture. I teach a survey course on Christian sacred architecture, and I mostly use 2-dimensional images to try to get across a 3-dimensional space, which is an empty space, not a space that's usually inhabited by people who are doing things in that space. It's usually photographs of the space empty, which is also not exactly true to what it is. So when we move into this question of how do you use artworks or liturgical spaces, sacred spaces for experiment, one of the things I learned very quickly was that psychologists have to control the experiment. So you can't really have too much variation. You sort of have to clamp down on how many strange flying different objects you're bringing in. We horrified our art history consultants because we insisted that all of the images had to be the same size. So as I said, they take a Vermeer painting, which is really very small in life, and make it the same size as a Raphael painting of some kind. And it just isn't right. It made me upset. And I had to keep saying, I'm upset by this. And so, but I know that was part of the process. And when we go to immersive AI, which we could have done a lot better than we did, I think, you're still not getting a real experience. It's still going to be somewhat controlled. And as good as it can be, it's not going to be the same. So I was very appreciative of your presentation, Taylor, because it deals with actual experience of art. But when you get to the question of scientific measurement, you're kind of left with surveys, right? And that may not be the best scientific approach from a scientist point of view, who like to work, your technologies with eye tracking and brain measurements and so forth. But anyway, thanks a lot. I'm sorry to be such a downer. I figured I warned everybody that I was going to do this. So.
And address, Milton, your comments. So thank you for saying that I'm intelligible to architects. It's always nice to hear that. On the question of whether this kind of information would change architects' minds, I would turn to my colleague on the left who says that we can't really change anybody's mind on anything. So that as a prelude, but I think my sense is that architects and young architects especially are starting to be much more open to this kind of information. And the other part I would say is there are 2 pieces. So I got to know Rafael Vignoli quite well, and he was an advisor on for my center before he suddenly passed away, and his son is now. And so that foundation, the Vignoli Foundation, I've been engaged with. And one of the things that Roman, his son, tells me is that in their general discourse now, this idea of coherence, fascination, hominess has been embedded, right? So as part, when they're, it's not changing how they're necessarily how they're doing things, but it's become part of the lexicon. And similarly, I sometimes get the letters wrong because architecture firms often have 3 letters and I can't remember what they are. But HSK, is that right in New York, like a big firm? HKS, okay. So Hannah Kassim, if you know her, invited me to give a talk to their group, and I came in. And she tells me also now that those 3 terms has become part of the lexicon in their conversations. So I think there are ways in which language can infiltrate how people are talking about it. And the question of intuition, I think very good architects who have strong intuitions, my experience is when I talk to them, it makes sense to them. And in some ways, to me, it's validating, because if I say something that an experienced, sophisticated architect who many people and I might respect says this doesn't make sense, the question is, are they so hidebound that they're unwilling to open their mind, or is there a problem with how we have come up with these constructs? And so that raises a kind of question. So that's what I would say is I'm hoping that this becomes part of the lexicon, and in 2 examples I know it has. The comment in my abstract about behavior preceding biology was not preceding in a temporal sense as much as that unless you have some handle on behavior, there is no neuroscience experiment to be done. And often I'll get people saying, well, why don't you just put them in a scanner and see what's happening in their brain, right? And, and the answer is the brain is always doing something unless you have a pretty good question you're asking of all of this noisy data, you get nothing. And to know what the question is and to have some sense of what behaviorally you think the answer is massively constrains in a good way the kinds of experiments you can do. So our practice is that we really want to get a handle on behavior, whether it's a survey, whether it's an actual experiment, whether it's observing behavior, like explicit behavior, what economists call revealed preference. So once you have a sense of that, then there's the possibility that some neuroscience measure is going to give us something useful.
Okay, before we move into our desk to work, we need to say goodbye to the Zoom community. Thank you for joining us. With this, we finish our broadcasting. So thank you for joining us.